Ever wonder how people survived the Middle Ages? Would you risk your life daily just to put food on the table? In medieval times, that wasn't a choice. It was reality. Number 9. Executioner. Could you sleep at night knowing your job was to kill people? Medieval executioners couldn't exactly swipe right into their career. They often inherited the grim role from family, or were criminals commuting their own sentences. These weren't just guys with axes. Executioners needed specialized skills for different death sentences. Hanging required precise rope length calculations to ensure a clean neck break rather than slow strangulation. Beheading demanded a sharp blade and perfect aim. A messy first swing meant having to hack away while the condemned suffered horribly. And for burning at the stake, they had to know exactly how to arrange the wood for the right amount of suffering. But the dangers weren't just physical. Executioners lived as social outcasts marked by their trade. They typically wore special clothing or symbols identifying their profession, couldn't enter churches through the main door, couldn't touch food at markets, and had to live outside town walls. Many turned to medicinal work on the side, utilizing their intimate knowledge of anatomy, creating the bizarre situation where the same hands that took lives also sometimes healed them. The psychological toll was immense. Some executioners went mad from isolation and the burden of their work. Others turned to alcohol. The most famous executioners kept journals and records of their work, with some tallying hundreds of killings over their careers. A French executioner from the Sanson family recorded performing 3,000 executions over a 40-year period. Even touching an executioner was considered contaminating. If you happened to brush against one in the street, you'd need to be ceremonially cleansed. With lives drenched in blood and rejection, executioners often passed their gruesome trade to their children, creating multi-generational dynasties of death because no one else would associate with them, and they had few other options for survival. Number 8. Plague Doctor. What if your job uniform looked like a nightmare come to life? Plague doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs and flowers, believing the sweet smells would protect them from disease. Spotter alert. They didn't. These weren't usually trained physicians, but desperate men hired by towns when qualified doctors fled. The costume, complete with waxed coat, gloves, boots, and hat, was essentially a medieval hazmat suit, designed with the mistaken belief that disease spread through bad smells. The iconic beak mask contained aromatic substances like amber, mint leaves, camphor, cloves, myrrh, rose petals, and straw. The doctors would peer through crystal lenses set into the mask while breathing through herb-filled beaks, completely unaware that their get-up did almost nothing against the actual bacterial infection. Their treatments were just as ineffective as their protective gear. Plague doctors would lance and drain buboes, the swollen lymph nodes characteristic of bubonic plague, apply leeches, or recommend mercury treatments, all while potentially spreading the disease themselves as they moved between patients. Some plague doctors took advantage of the chaos, charging exorbitant fees from desperate families. Others genuinely tried to help, but had no real understanding of what they were fighting. Many became infected themselves, with some estimates suggesting that over 50% of plague doctors eventually contracted and died from the very disease they were trying to treat. The psychological horror of the job cannot be overstated. Imagine spending your days surrounded by the dying, witnessing entire families and communities being wiped out, all while knowing your methods weren't working. Some plague doctors turned to alcohol or opiates to cope. Others became desensitized to death entirely. The strange beaked figure became so associated with doom that even today, hundreds of years later, the plague doctor mask remains one of the most disturbing images from medieval times. Despite the extreme risks, towns desperate for medical help during plague outbreaks offered substantial payment, enough that some men voluntarily took on the role. In 1348, the city of Venice was offering plague doctors the equivalent of a modern doctor's annual salary for just a few months of work. Number 7. Miner. Could you spend 12 hours a day in pitch darkness, breathing toxic dust, never knowing if the ground above would collapse? Medieval miners did. Mining in the Middle Ages was primitive, dangerous, and often fatal. Workers descended into narrow, unstable shafts with nothing but candles for light. Tunnels were typically just wide enough for a man to squeeze through, with minimal supports made from timber that often rotted or failed. Cave-ins were common and deadly. The air itself was a killer. Without proper ventilation, oxygen levels would drop dangerously low. Candles would flicker and die. A warning sign that humans would soon follow. Toxic gases like carbon monoxide collected in shafts, sometimes killing entire crews in minutes. Miners called these invisible killers damps, from the German Dampf meaning vapor. The black damp would suffocate, while fire damp, methane, could explode when exposed to candle flames. Tools were primitive: iron picks, hammers, and wooden shovels. For hard rock mining, fire setting was common. Miners would build a fire against the rock face, heat it intensely, then douse it with cold water to crack the stone. This created deadly clouds of smoke in the already poorly ventilated tunnels. Children as young as 6 worked in medieval mines, their small bodies perfect for navigating the narrowest tunnels. Many developed permanent deformities from crawling through low passages before their bones fully developed. The term coal miner's hunch described the distinctive curved spine that came from years spent bent over in low tunnels. Medieval miners often developed silicosis, a deadly lung disease caused by inhaling rock dust. With no masks or protection, their lungs would gradually fill with sharp silica particles, leading to a slow, painful death by suffocation. Most miners didn't live past 30, their bodies worn down by the brutal conditions and toxic exposure. Water was another constant threat. Many shafts extended below the water table, requiring constant bailing. When primitive pumps failed, tunnels would flood in minutes. Miners caught in flooding shafts rarely escaped. Perhaps most terrifying were the superstitions. Miners believed in knockers or kobolds, supernatural creatures that inhabited the mines. A knocking sound might be interpreted as a warning from these spirits, but it was often just the sound of timber supports beginning to fail. The folklore provided some psychological comfort in the darkness, but it couldn't save them from the very real dangers surrounding them every minute underground. Number 6. Leech collector. Would you wade barefoot into swampy waters to let blood-sucking parasites attach to your legs? That was just another Tuesday for medieval leech collectors. Before modern medicine, bloodletting with leeches was a common treatment for everything from headaches to hemorrhoids. Someone had to collect these creatures, and it was a job few wanted. Leech collectors, also called leech finders or leech gatherers, would wade into ponds and marshes with bare legs, allowing the leeches to attach themselves. Once they had collected enough of the bloodsuckers on their own bodies, they would pluck them off and store them in containers. The most skilled collectors could time their harvesting perfectly, removing the leeches right before they became fully gorged with blood. The dangers were numerous. Medieval wetlands harbored all manner of diseases, from potentially fatal infections like tetanus to parasitic illnesses like giardia. Collecting leeches in dirty, stagnant water with open wounds from the leeches themselves was essentially inviting infection. Some leech collectors would bait the creatures with the fresh blood of animals or even their own, enhancing the risk of blood poisoning. Others use rotting meat or animal entrails tied to their legs, which attracted not just leeches, but other dangerous creatures. Excessive blood loss was a serious concern. A single medicinal leech can consume 5 to 10 ml of blood, not a problem with 1 or 2, but collectors often accumulated dozens on their bodies at once. Records exist of collectors fainting in marshes from blood loss, sometimes drowning as a result. By the 19th century, the demand for medicinal leeches had grown so enormous that leech collectors were unable to keep up. In France alone, about 100 million leeches were used annually, and collectors had nearly depleted the natural population. This scarcity made the job even more dangerous, as collectors ventured into more hazardous wetlands seeking the valuable creatures. The pale, sickly appearance of career leech collectors was so distinctive that it became a literary trope. The profession was considered so vile that leech collectors, like executioners, often lived as social outcasts. Despite the dangers and social stigma, the job paid relatively well during leeches shortages, with collectors able to sell their bloody harvest to apothecaries and physicians at premium prices. Ever wondered who dealt with plague-carrying vermin before modern pest control? Medieval rat catchers faced disease, bites, and public scorn, all while playing a crucial public health role few recognized. Rat catchers used various methods to eliminate rodents, from traps and poisons to trained dogs and ferrets. Some would smoke rats out of their nests, while others would sit patiently in infested areas at night, catching them by hand. The job required intimate knowledge of rat behavior and hiding places. The most obvious danger was disease. Rats carried fleas that transmitted bubonic plague, which killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population during the Black Death. Rat catchers had extraordinarily high exposure to these disease vectors. They also risked contracting rat, bite fever, leptospirosis, and various other bacterial infections. Rat bites themselves were painful and dangerous. A cornered rat can jump surprisingly high and will bite ferociously to escape. Before antibiotics, even minor rat bites could lead to serious infections. Some rat catchers had hands and arms covered in scars from years of bites. The poisons used by rat catchers posed another danger. Arsenic compounds were common rat poisons, and handling these substances regularly led to chronic poisoning among the catchers themselves. Symptoms included hair loss, skin lesions, and eventually organ failure. Some rat catchers inadvertently poisoned themselves while preparing baits. Despite the important public health service they provided, rat catchers were social outcasts. The association with filth and disease made them unwelcome in most establishments. Many worked at night to avoid public contact and lived in poor conditions on the outskirts of towns. The profession had its own strange customs. Some rat catchers kept count of their kills, with the most experienced claiming tens of thousands over their careers. Others developed almost supernatural reputations, with folk tales suggesting they could communicate with rats or command them like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Payment often came on a per-rat basis, with catchers required to present rat tails as proof of their work. This created perverse incentives. Some unscrupulous rat catchers were known to breed rats secretly to ensure steady employment. Others would catch rats, remove their tails for payment, then release the rats back into the wild to reproduce and create more work. Number 4. Gong farmer. Could you spend your days literally swimming in human waste? Gong farmers cleaned medieval cesspits with their bare hands, and somehow weren't even the worst job on this list. Also called gongfirmors or nightmen. Because they worked after dark, these workers emptied the cesspits and privies of castles and towns. The name comes from the Old English word gong, meaning toilet. Their task involved climbing down into pits filled with human excrement, shoveling it into buckets, and hauling it away for disposal. The stench was unbearable. Gong farmers would often drink heavily before and during work to dull their senses. Many developed characteristic skin conditions from constant exposure to human waste. Infections and parasites were occupational hazards. Intestinal worms, dysentery, and other Descentol's diseases were common. Perhaps most dangerous was the risk of asphyxiation. Decomposing waste produces methane and hydrogen sulfide gases, which can displace oxygen in confined spaces and cause rapid unconsciousness and death. Countless gong farmers died after being overcome by fumes in deep cesspits. The social stigma was intense. Gong farmers typically worked at night and lived in designated areas outside town walls. They were required to identify themselves, sometimes, by wearing a badge or distinctive clothing. Many taverns and churches refused them entry due to their smell, which clung to them despite their best efforts at washing. Surprisingly, despite, or perhaps because of these hardships, gong farmers in medieval London were relatively well paid. The job was so undesirable that cities had to offer decent compensation. In 16th century England, gong farmers could earn up to 2 shillings per ton of waste removed, several times what an unskilled laborer might make. The collected waste, called night soil, had value as agricultural fertilizer. Gong farmers would transport their malodorous cargo to designated dumps outside city walls, where it would be collected by farmers. Some Offenale gong farmers cut out the middleman and sold directly to agricultural operations, increasing their earnings. Occupational hazards included falling into the cesspits and drowning, exposure to toxic gases, and occasionally discovering dangerous objects discarded in the waste. There are records of gong farmers finding corpses of murder victims, aborted fetuses, and valuable items accidentally dropped into privies. The profession existed well into the 19th century in many European cities, only disappearing with the development of modern sewage systems. The last official gong farmers in London worked in the 1850s, before the Great Stink of 1858 finally prompted the city to build proper sewers. Number 3. Bell founder. Did you know medieval bell makers routinely went deaf, suffered horrific burns, and sometimes died in massive bronze explosions? Creating church bells was an art paid for in blood and suffering. Bell founding required casting enormous bronze bells, weighing up to several tons. The process involved heating a mixture of copper and tin to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, then pouring the molten metal into precisely crafted molds. Any mistake could be catastrophic. The foundry itself was an inferno. Workers labored in sweltering heat around blazing furnaces with temperatures high enough to instantly cause third-degree burns if the metal splashed. Protective equipment was minimal, perhaps a leather apron and gloves. Many bell founders bore hideous burn scars from close calls with molten bronze. Hearing damage was inevitable. The hammering of metal, roar of furnaces, and testing of the bells themselves gradually destroyed workers' hearing. Most experienced bell founders were partially or completely deaf. The irony wasn't lost on medievals, who noted that those who created the sounds of heaven often couldn't hear them. The most terrifying danger was mold failure. If moisture was trapped in a bell mold when molten metal was poured in, it would instantly vaporize and expand, causing an explosion of scalding metal. Numerous bell founders died this way, essentially cooked by the metal they worked with. Others were crushed when massive bells fell during mounting or testing. The metals themselves were toxic. Melting copper produces fumes that can cause metal fume fever. Symptoms include chills, fever, and respiratory issues. Prolonged exposure to tin dust affects the nervous system. Most devastating was lead, often added to the bronze alloy, which slowly poisoned founders, causing tremors, cognitive impairment, and eventually death. Bell founding was often a family business, passed through generations, partly because the techniques were closely guarded secrets, and partly because outsiders rarely volunteered for such dangerous work. Some founding families produced bells for hundreds of years, developing distinctive styles recognizable to experts even today. The spiritual aspect of the work added psychological pressure. Church bells were considered sacred objects that connected earth to heaven. Founders weren't just craftsmen, but creators of holy instruments. A failed bell casting might be seen as a sign of divine displeasure. Some founders performed religious rituals before major castings, praying for protection and success. Despite the dangers, successful bell founders could achieve substantial wealth and status. The largest bells required extraordinary skill to cast properly, and those who consistently succeeded became famous. Their signatures can still be found on medieval bells hanging in European churches today, lasting tributes to craftsmen who often sacrificed their health and sometimes lives to create them. Number 2. Tanner. Would you soak your hands in urine, dog feces, and brain matter for hours every day? Medieval tanners did exactly that to transform animal hides into leather. The tanning process began with collecting fresh animal skins from butchers. These untreated hides quickly rotted and attracted vermin. So the first step was preservation. Tanners would soak the skins in urine, often collected from the entire community in designated pots, to begin breaking down the tissue. Next came unhairing the hides. Tanners created a caustic lime solution or concoction called dog confect, literally dog feces, that they rubbed into the skins. Workers would manually scrape away fur fat and remaining flesh with knives after these treatments. The process required constant handling of the decomposing material with bare hands. The smell was so repulsive that tanneries were legally required to operate outside city walls. Workers absorbed this stench into their skin and clothing so thoroughly that they were often banned from churches and public gatherings. Many tanners lived in isolated communities near their workplaces, essentially quarantined from society. The chemicals used were extremely dangerous. Lime could cause chemical burns and blindness. Some tanning methods used arsenic compounds, which were absorbed through the skin, causing chronic poisoning. Others used alum, which irritated lungs and created painful skin conditions after prolonged exposure. Brain tanning, using animal brains to create soft, supple leather, exposed workers to potential prion diseases. Tanners who processed deer hides using cervid brains had increased risk of contracting chronic wasting disease, a fatal brain condition. Physical injuries were common. Sharp knives used for scraping frequently slipped, causing deep cuts that easily became infected from the bacteria. Rich materials tanners constantly handled. Larger operations used massive wooden drums for processing, hides which could crush workers who got too close. The final stages of medieval tanning often utilized oak bark solutions containing high levels of tannic acid. While effective for creating durable leather, tannic acid damaged the skin of workers, causing hardening and discoloration. Long-term exposure has been linked to increased rates of certain cancers, though medieval tanners rarely lived long enough to develop these. Despite these dangers, tanning was an essential trade. Without leather, there would be no shoes, saddles, armor belts, or countless other necessary items. The skilled transformation of rotting animal skin into durable, waterproof leather was considered almost magical by some, and master tanners could achieve considerable wealth if they survived the toxic conditions long enough. The brutal reality of tanning changed little from Roman times until the Industrial Revolution. It was so notoriously awful that it became a standard threat to unmotivated children. Study hard, or you'll end up working in the tannery. Number 1. Guillemot, egg collector. What job required dangling hundreds of feet above jagged rocks on homemade rope swings just to collect bird eggs? Britain's Guillemot egg collectors risked everything for a quirky delicacy. Guillemots are seabirds that lay their eggs on narrow cliff ledges along coastlines, particularly in northern Britain. Their eggs were considered delicacies and commanded high prices. The birds deliberately nest on the most inaccessible cliff faces to protect their eggs from predators, and this made collecting them an extraordinarily dangerous profession. The basic technique was nightmarish. A collector would be lowered on a rope from the cliff top by several partners. Dangling in midair, sometimes hundreds of feet above rocks and crashing waves, he would swing himself toward the cliff face to reach nesting ledges. Using a small net or basket, he'd quickly gather eggs before pushing off again to reach the next ledge. The ropes were often homemade from hemp or other natural fibers, prone to fraying and breaking. No safety equipment existed beyond the collector's own skill and the strength of his partners above. Communication was nearly impossible over the sounds of ocean and seabirds, meaning collectors often had to make life or death decisions while hanging in space. Weather added another deadly variable. Sudden wind gusts could slam collectors against the rock face or swing them out too far to reach their targets. Rain made ropes slippery and ledges treacherous. Fog could disorient both the collector and those holding the ropes above. The birds themselves posed dangers. Disturbed guillemots would sometimes attack collectors' faces and eyes. Some cliff faces hosted mixed colonies, including larger, more aggressive seabirds like gannets, which can deliver devastating stabs with their sharp beaks. Physical requirements for the job were extreme. Collectors needed exceptional grip strength to cling to ropes for extended periods, often while being buffeted by winds. They required remarkable core strength to control their swinging and reaching motions while suspended. Upper body power was essential for climbing backup ropes when necessary. The profession was often generational, with techniques and specific knowledge of local cliffs passed from father to son. Certain families became known as the most skilled collectors in their regions, developing reputations for reaching the most inaccessible ledges. The prized eggs themselves were distinctive, pointed at one end and rounded at the other, a shape that prevents them from rolling off narrow ledges. Their shells displayed extraordinarily varied patterns and colors, ranging from white to blue to brown, with unique speckles and markings. Each guillemot lays eggs with her own consistent pattern, allowing her to recognize her egg among thousands on crowded ledges. Despite the extreme risk, successful collectors could earn substantial seasonal income. In Victorian times, when the practice reached its height, a skilled collector might gather hundreds of eggs in a season, selling them to upscale restaurants and wealthy private clients. The practice continued in some remote British coastal communities until being outlawed in the mid-20th century. Some collectors inevitably fell to their deaths. In the small communities where egg collecting was practiced, nearly everyone knew someone who had died on the cliffs. Yet each spring, men would return to the cliff edges driven by tradition, economic necessity, and perhaps the intangible appeal of testing themselves against nature at its most extreme. Would you risk your life just to earn a living? After learning about these medieval professions, doesn't your modern job suddenly seem a lot more appealing?